Crawford TV. The world is thinking.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this timely debate on Scared of the Kids, the rising panic about youth crime. I'm Maria Grasso, and your chair for this evening. Before I introduce our star cast of speakers here with us this evening, let me thank our sponsor, the IOI Current Affairs Forum. The Current Affairs Forum meets monthly. The next meeting, in fact, will be next Sunday here in central London, and discusses some of the main news behind the ideas behind the headlines. And the past discussions have looked at the credit crunch and the American elections. So please, if you're interested in joining these discussions, do sign up. You can do that at the registration desk, and you should have a sign-up sheet in your delegate packs. All right, as I said, we're very, very lucky to have four very distinguished speakers with us this evening. In the order in which they will be speaking, let me introduce Dr. Stuart Wilson, sitting here on my right. Dr. Stuart Wilson is a sociology lecturer at the University of Dundee, Abertay, and he's a director of the research group Generation Youth Issues. He's also a regular contributor to the Times Educational Supplement, and he has authored two important books, The Politics of Antisocial Behaviour and Scared of the Kids, Curfews, Crime and Regulation of Young People, which has clearly been the inspiration behind this session. They're both available from the Foyles bookshop in the foyer, so if you're interested in this kind of topic, do have a look at what they have on offer. Next to speak is Professor Adam Crawford, on my far left. He is Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice and Director of the Centre for Criminal Justice Studies at the University of Leeds. He's published widely on the themes of policing, community safety, restorative criminal justice, and his current research project explores the impact of antisocial behaviour interventions on young people. He has numerous awards. He's on the editorial boards of numerous important reviews, such as the British Journal of Criminology, the European Journal of Criminology, and Déviance et Société. He is currently completing a book on the contractual governance of antisocial behaviour, and his other publications include, which are also at the Foyles bookshop if you're interested, Youth Offending and Restorative Justice, The Local Governance of Crime, Integrating Victims in Restorative Youth Justice. Next, we're also very, very pleased to have with us a very busy man, Kit Malthouse, on my far right. He is London's Deputy Mayor for Policing. He was appointed to this post after being elected to the London Assembly in May 2008, representing the West Central constituency. He studied politics and economics at Newcastle, and he's a qualified chartered accountant. In 1998, Kit was elected to Westminster City Council, and his first major job was to head the Social Services Department, where he initiated a number of radical initiatives, halving the number of street homelessness in the city. Okay, last but not least, we're very excited to have Mark Easton here with us today. As you may know, Mark Easton is the BBC's home editor, a role that he describes as sitting on a cloud and reporting on how Britain is changing. Mark heads the BBC's UK specialist unit, comprising some 60 journalists. He's an award-winning documentary maker and news correspondent, and appears regularly on BBC television and radio. As well as writing for BBC Online. You might have looked at his blog. It might have been linked to the recommended readings, I think, where Mark's written some very interesting stuff in terms of the statistics and the news that crime is falling, or is it falling? Is it rising? What's going on with reporting those kind of stats? He has a very broad expertise, and he's won numerous awards. And if you want to know more about that, you can check his speaker profile on the website. Great. So can I please have a round of applause for our four fantastic speakers for joining us today. Okay. So before I introduce the topic and before we hear from our speakers for their introductions, a couple quick words on how this session is going to be run. First, we'll hear from each of the speakers in the order in which I introduced them for about 7 minutes each. And then I'm going to perhaps ask a couple questions to sort of unpack some of the issues surrounding this topic. And then I'm going to head out to you guys for points and questions and so on. Please make your voice heard. I'm going to try to come out for at least 2 batches of questions, and then I'm going to ask our speakers to get back to those points and eventually at the end sum up in 1 minute. Great. So, as you may well be aware of, this is a timely and important debate. Just last week, we heard news that serious crime had been underreported. What seems to have happened is that actually the people reporting crime were putting crime in one kind of box, and actually then there was a sort of recategorization of what that crime actually consisted in, and people started, and they were supposed to be ticking another box, but didn't do so, causing all kinds of confusions. But actually it seems that crime effectively has been declining. What has changed is just in which box, what kind of crime you categorize it as. So given all these kinds of issues and the way in which these debates are in the sort of mainstream political debate, I think one of the main questions I think that I hope the speakers will address and that we should really unpack is what's going on. So is it, it seems that actually crime in absolute terms is falling, but we seem to be a lot more nervous about crime, especially in relation to young people and antisocial behaviour. So what's going on? What's behind this sort of fear, this kind of panic that we have about young people and crime? And I guess we've got our speakers here to help us out figuring those kind of answers. So please, Stuart, can you kick us off?
Yeah, okay. My Scared of the Kids book is on sale here, which is a more kind of nitty-gritty of issues to do with young people and certain aspects of, if you like, panics to a certain extent around these issues. Now, politics of antisocial behaviour isn't, but it's £60. So it's £60, so I can't imagine that would be a major problem in terms of sales. But I'm going to look at some of the themes out of that book here, which is much more looking at a more abstract and general look at some trends in society that might influence how crime, the fear of crime and violence in particular, is looked at. I was in Edinburgh Airport travelling down here, and they had a huge billboard, the sort of billboard that welcomes you to the city, and it said, "Welcome to Edinburgh, home of the Royal Bank of Scotland, make it happen." And I thought, oh, that's a bit of a, I think they'd probably want to take that one down now with everything that's happened. And I remembered that about 6 or 7 years ago, I was in Glasgow Airport, and they had a big sign up, and it said, "Welcome to Glasgow, safe city." And I thought that's an interesting way of projecting yourself as a safe city. And it was the American author Christopher Lasch who in the 1970s made the point that just a decade previously, America had seen itself and understood itself as a country that could rule the world. Its ideas and ideals could rule the world. And by the mid-70s, they were nervous at even making New York City safe. And what he was looking at was not the issue of safety itself, but more the lowering of expectations of the people who were running society, and how safety was an issue in relation to that, which I think is interesting. And I think to understand some of these problems, it's useful to recognize how central the category of safety has become in terms of local authorities, government strategy, and so on and so forth. So community safety is a clear illustration of that. I think to some extent it might reflect public anxieties, and I think that's true. I'm not going to look at that in any great detail. I think more interestingly, it also reflects an outlook by the political elite in society. And I also think there's something in terms of a changed relationship between the public and politics, where previously you had a relationship that was more based on citizens who were active, whereas today I think it's much more a changed relationship where you have a form of advocacy for victims or for the vulnerable, where we're all understood more within categories to do with risk, safety, and vulnerability. So and within that there's a certain sense of the engaging with powerlessness and a sense of powerlessness in society, which again I think you can think about in terms of the public and the political elite. Obviously there are some victims who are more perfect, if you like, on the victim tree, And one of the victims that would stand out would be a parent of a child who has been killed. And that's obviously been an issue recently in terms of young people being murdered. And I suppose the pinnacle of the tree of victimhood would be the McCann family, where you've had a child killed, as far as we can all understand it, by a paedophile. If you like, that's the sort of the peak of the victim in society, where the victim appears to have a lot of power or influence. And in Britain, we saw the McCann family were media celebrities, if you want to use that term, for almost a year, which is a strange development that's taken place over the last decade or so. But it's not just safety that's become an institutionalized prism, if you like, through which things are looked at. I also started to look, just for this talk, at the issue of violence over the last month or so. And I thought it was quite interesting that I hadn't realized how much violence in and of itself has become a kind of framework for organizations to develop research to be produced and so forth. And again, this is trying to think of how issues that we're looking at today, like violent crime in particular, has become such a big issue. So in 2002, there was a world report on violence by the World Health Organization. In 2005 in Scotland, you had this Scotland Violence Reduction Unit set up. And within that, interestingly, the person who heads that says, we've had a high level of violence in this country for 4 decades. And he recognises that violence hasn't increased particularly or substantially. It's existed, but we haven't had previously this violence reduction unit, but now we do. This is the Scottish Executive have set up the anti-violence campaign. This was launched in 2006, a year-long campaign, and this was part of the Safer Scotland campaign in Scotland. It lists 115 projects and has various papers attached to it. What's interesting is violence has become a category. It's a thing in itself that it can be used to try and analyse and understand many problems. So, for example, they mention war, rape and bullying. These are all forms of violence. Which to me seems quite problematic that you start to lump these very, very different things within this category of violence, try and understand them all together. They also list suicide, child abuse, robbery, racial violence, violence at work, gangs, so on and so forth. And the list goes on and on. And there seems to be a complete collapse of a capacity to analyse these things as perhaps being separate. So you get violence of children being lumped together with violence of adults, violence in the home, violence at work, and also state violence with the violence of individuals. And the distinction between these things appears to get lost. In the World Report on Violence and Health, this is in the summary, this is the opening paragraph, in terms of how it affects everybody. Violence, a universal challenge. It's something we can now unite around, if you like. It says, no country or community is untouched by violence. Images and account of violence pervade the media. It is on our streets, in our homes, schools, workplaces and institutions. Violence is a universal scourge that tears at the fabric of communities and threatens the life, health and happiness of us all. So run for the hills seems to be the message. Just to finish off, I think what's interesting about this is how safety and issues like violence have become, if you like, institutionalized, institutional frameworks that have previously been set up before we've had this whole issue about violence rising in places like London in particular. You've had these institutions set up, this framework, this way of understanding things. You also have within this this idea of prevention, and prevention has become, if you like, an all-encompassing category. I've got 1 minute, so I'm just going to. This issue of prevention, I think, is interesting. I said in the last session that I think prevention would probably be New Labour's slogan today if they wanted to run with it. And it seems quite an enlightened idea. Let's prevent problems. It's more social, more all-encompassing. That's how it appears. I'd like to put an alternative argument forward that this is a reflection of the mindset of the people who run society. That how they think about things is the prevention of harm rather than the creation of good, which is a very different frame of mind. I think it's a defensive mindset about damage limitation rather than possibilities, where people in society are understood to be damaged and damaging. And I think it's a very pessimistic mindset, despite all the things they say, very pessimistic. And I'll leave you with a quote. This is by James Q. Wilson, who's a very well-known conservative criminologist in America. And he's describing here the problem he sees of there being more young people in American society. And he says this: "Meanwhile, just beyond the horizon, there lurks a cloud that the winds will soon bring over us. The population will start getting younger again. By the end of the decade, there will be 1 million more people between the ages of 14 and 17 than there are now. This increase will follow the decade of the 1980s, when people in that age group declined, not only as a proportion of the total population, but in absolute numbers. This extra million young people will be half male. 6% of them will become high-rate repeat offenders. 30,000 more young muggers, killers, and thieves than we have now." And I think that is a mindset that impinges upon a lot of social policy, that profound pessimism, where when you look at young people, what you see is a potential 30,000 more young muggers, killers, and thieves than we have now. Get ready, he says. My argument in that respect would be, it's less that we have a broken society, but that we have a broken elite.
Okay, just to start off and just pick up a couple of points before making some points that I wanted to make. I mean, social historians are very good and very important in reminding us of the dangers of amnesia. And any idea that we live in a more violent society, more violent than, for example, Dickensian London, is, of course, highly problematic. And I think we need to put in any context some kind of wider historical perspective. Another point about violence, of course, if we wanted to sit here and talk about the violence that wrought, and by violence I mean death, blood, and gore, that's wrought in a British society, we wouldn't talk about young people, we would talk about cars and vehicles, and we'd talk about the mass carnage that's actually caused on the roads. Of course, those aren't necessarily media important issues. Youth happens to be. What I want to do in the points that I just want to make is kind of focus on the question of fear of youth. Why is war? And begin to kind of, and there are wider issues, some of which Stuart's talked about, but of course social historians remind us that, of course, the idea that youth somehow is problematic is not new. Recurring generations look back with gold-tinted, rose-tinted glasses on some kind of notion of some golden past, when youth was somehow less problematic, usually adults' own youth. But of course, actually, periodically, there have been over history concerns about some notion that young people are becoming more lawless and somehow eroding the fabric of a British way of life. Hence, in some senses, concerns about antisocial youth may tell us more about adult anxieties than they do about the nature of young people's behaviour. Certainly today, none of our best sources of data, and there's lots of questions we can make about the paucity and the inadequacy of data, but certainly the best sources of data that we do have, from self-report surveys through victimisation surveys where they're available, and recorded crimes, suggests that there is no significant increase in relation to youth crime, and particularly in relation to some of the more media salient issues about youth crimes. That's not to deny that there are individual and too often unpleasant stories. What certainly our best data does tell us that in recent years there has been an increasing number of young people drawn into the youth justice system. That the criminalisation of youth is clearly something that is taking place. In the 3 years up to the end of 2006, some 26% new youth disposals were used by the youth court. So we have, regardless of, and we can debate the extent of our knowledge about youth crime, but certainly our responses to crime and youth in particular are changing. Why might that be? I will just look at or highlight three potential issues. One is the changing nature of intergenerational relations. The second is the different, and what I'm trying to focus on are new things, whilst having historical references to the past. So the first is intergenerational relations. The second are new pressures on young people. I don't think that it's enough to kind of revert to the Who's kind of classic notion of the kids are all right. I think actually that there are specific issues about current youth and the pressures upon young people which express themselves sometimes in problematic ways. But finally, and that's what I was alluding to there, to say something about social responses to behaviour and how they have changed. So first of all, intergenerational relations, of course, actually, contrary to James Q. Wilson's quote that we had there, actually what is changing is that his population is becoming older. Populations aren't becoming younger, and actually that's one of the key issues in terms of intergenerational concerns, that we have an ageing population, a population for some very understandable reasons may have heightened sense of anxieties, but also may have a greater dissonance in terms of cultural proximity with young people, for very understandable, again, reasons. So that what we have also is, I think, a transformation in youth. It's often couched in the language of the decline of deference, but I think it's more than that. It's also about the way in which young people and adults relate to each other. That nowadays, young people are not reliant upon adults to slowly impart the secrets of adulthood to them in a way in which in previous generations they did. Young people have much greater access to information. They can find out themselves in ways in which they don't rely upon adult figures. Adult figures had much greater authority and control in a sense that transition from childhood to adulthood. That might be something we might be concerned about, but it's a fact of the contemporary modern information age that we have and we have to address. So in some senses, I would suggest adult fears are a product of a changing relationship between adults and young people, which leaves them feeling more fearful and a sense of loss of control over youth, as well as some sense a kind of greater dissonance with young people. Young people, of course, are much better able to adapt to the technologies that modern society presents to them. Most adults have to defer to their children to switch on the new computer or to how to work their iPod, rather than vice versa. So in some senses, young people actually may be ahead technologically than are their peers. Secondly, in terms of the pressures that I think that confronts for young people, I think there's a real dissonance for young people. On the one hand, we're assumed to live in a society of greater choice. That choice is presented as a meta idea of contemporary societies, that young people have choice, but more, they have to choose. Young people are increasingly asked to construct their life histories, their future trajectories, in a way in which previous generations didn't, a way in which there were much clearer sense of what their futures may hold. However, that illusion to and allusion of choice actually confronts a very real social barrier. Actually, today in British society, it is a more immobile social structure than it is mobile. So on the one hand, there's the notion of choice, but on the other hand, there's the reality of often blocked opportunities, particularly amongst certain groups of young people, and particularly amongst boys. And it's not necessarily surprising that, in a sense, in the winning and losing, in terms of that idea of choice and yet the reality that young people confront. Ulrich Beck characterises this, that young people are increasingly asked to find biographic solutions to systemic problems. In other words, social structural issues are then presented to young people as having the responsibilities to, in a sense, make their own bed. But importantly, they then become blamed and blameworthy for the bad choices that sometimes they make. So that on the one hand, choice is offered up, but on the other hand, the responsibilities and the burdens that go with it, despite the constraints that young people have to confront, are also presented. The third point that I was going to make was about social responses and the way in which, particularly criminal justice responses, and are by adult societies, resort to criminalisation as a means of regulating and a means of responding to young people's behaviour. Because, of course, what we do know about young people and criminality is most young people grow out of crime, and so that, therefore, there are issues about the way in which you respond to young people's behaviour that may have long-term implications for the trajectories that they have. We live in I suggest, a society, and it's a political point that I'll conclude with, a society in which behaviour and the politics of behaviour has, in a sense, replaced the politics of much bigger social and structural issues. That in some senses governments have narrowed and resighted their energies onto the micromanagement of behaviour, partly because in a global era, the flow of capital, the flow of people, the flow of goods are actually not easily constrained and controlled. That increasingly governments have recited, in a sense, their capacity to, in a sense, show that they can do something by managing people's behaviour, and particularly young people's behaviour, because it may be something that they actually can suggest that they can do something about.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. At the beginning of his book, Youth and Crime, David Munsey points out that while the words adult and child have a largely neutral meaning, the word youth conjures up troublesome images for most people in society. And I guess the first question as a politician we had to ask ourselves, or politicians we had to ask ourselves when we came into office at City Hall, was, are people actually more scared of kids, or are they just more intolerant of kids? And I think the truth is both. Certainly the data shows that they are more fearful of young people. In August, of the 624 ward panels in London that reported preference for priorities, 451 put youths hanging around as a top priority. In 1992, people were most likely to complain about noisy neighbours. Now it's kids hanging around. And in London, 1.7 million people reported that they'd not gone out because of kids hanging around, and 1.5 had considered moving house because of the activities of youths in their area. But at the same time, that's mixed in with quite a lot of intolerance of young people. When it snows in London, the Met receives several hundred phone calls about kids throwing snowballs. Halloween results in a 40 to 50% rise in 999 calls. It's easily the busiest night for the Met Police of the entire year. But having said that, there is a general anxiety in London, which we've seen reflected at City Hall in the rise in the post bag, simply because we've started to take ownership of the issue and talk more about the issue. Before the election in May, the community safety team received about 20, 30 letters a week. At the moment, we're receiving between 500 and 700 a week, and that has been consistent. It hasn't tailed off as we've got further away from the election. If anything, it's rising. And I think it's driven by two things. One, there is undoubtedly a general sense of a lack of order and control in the public realm. And I'm interested in what Adam had to say about the state intervening. I do think that as, to a certain extent, the state has intervened more and more in our lives. We as a society have taken less and less responsibility. It's certainly the case that children do not now expect to be disciplined on the street by strange adults for misbehaviour. And often, those adults who have intervened have resulted in signal crimes which have affected people's perception of youth. So the lady in Birmingham who was assaulted on the bus for asking school kids not to throw popcorn at other passengers was beaten up by 9 or 10 kids, reported widely across the media. And I do think those signal crimes, along with the rise in youth murders, 15, 16, 27 last year and 27 so far this year, has contributed to a general air of anxiety about young people. But the further question is then, do Londoners in particular and people in general have a reason to be more frightened of young people? And the truth is, it kind of yes stroke depends. I mean, there has been a rise, a spike in the trend in youth violence and youth antisocial behaviour across the capital. That's seen across all boroughs. But at the same time, the richer you are, and interestingly, the further southwest you live, the less likely you are to experience any kind of youth crime at all. And if you live in Richmond, highly unlikely. You're more likely to live your whole life without experiencing it than you are to experience any. But I do think that there are two issues there which need to be addressed. One is the effect of signal crimes. It's undoubtedly the case that one or two high-level, high-profile crimes can affect people's perception of youth crime. We all know that 1993 saw the murder of Jamie Bulger in Liverpool, and it was then that the rhetoric started from the politicians, from Michael Howard, Prison Works, Tony Blair, tough on crime, and it was at that point that we started locking up more and more young people, for better or worse, and I'll come on to that. But it's undoubtedly the case that that kind of crime can cause an issue. In Kensington and Chelsea, The last confidence survey is a very, very safe part of London, but they've had a couple of signal crimes there. Christopher Monckton was killed on his doorstep, banker in Chelsea, if you remember. There was the shooting on the King's Road not very long ago. And then there were 2 teen murders, not in Kensington Chelsea, but on either side, Amro al-Badawi in Queen's Park and Kojo Yenga in Hammersmith. Nevertheless, 50% of people in Kensington Chelsea say they're more likely to see a police officer. 37% know more about local policing, but there's been a 24% drop in confidence in policing in Kensington Chelsea, and we think that's almost entirely down to those signal crimes. I do think there's also an issue here for the media. It's undoubtedly the case that because we have a very close-packed media in the UK, lots of newspapers and outlets all competing for the news, they get into an auction of scandal, of fear and salaciousness, which contributes to a general atmosphere of fear. And that is also found by politicians who require the media for exposure and therefore talk in very negative terms about young people because he thinks, frankly, it gets them votes. So from our point of view, we wanted to come at this from 2 different angles. And just quickly, if I may, just talk about the strategy briefly, because we are tomorrow morning launching our youth strategy. Yeah, we had 3 things in mind on the press. 1, the press only report bad news, criticism and action. So you will have seen some action from us in terms of named police operations, Operation Blunt on knives, Tyrrell putting more people on the transport system, more crime fighters than there have been for 30 years, to give a sense of ownership. But tomorrow you will see more action in terms of long-term solutions. That's focusing on the young offending system, which doesn't currently work, if anything makes things worse. We lock up getting on for 10,000 people now. It was 5,000 back in 1993, and if anything, the problem has got worse. We'll be looking at care, truancy, respect, sport, and positive images. We do want to try and counter as much of the negative press around young people as possible, because the vast majority of young people do not present us with a significant problem. It's a very small minority that cause a general level of unease across London, and we think we can do something about that small cohort.
Well, before I came down, I had 2 slices of shortbread in the green room, because I did read on the front page of the Sunday Times that the BBC is going to starve its staff, or at least those well-paid members. I don't think that probably does include me. I'm not a fat cat. But this, of course, was the consequence of a nasty, childish prank played upon a pensioner. So it probably does fit into the category that we're talking about today. Are we scared of children? I think people are perhaps a little bit more frightened than they used to be, because we live in a rather fragmenting society. The extended families, which used to sort of be the dominant structure, don't exist anymore, or far fewer. And so the likelihood is the little old lady walking to the post office to pick up her pension and seeing a crowd of young people wearing hoodies hanging around outside. Perhaps 25 years ago, she'd have gone up to them and said, "Hello, Charlie, how are you?" And that would have been a friend of her grandson, if not her grandson herself. But that doesn't happen anymore. And equally, the people hanging around the post office would have no idea who this person was. After all, old people are either sort of smelly, slightly deranged, or possibly paedophiles. I mean, there is a real generational segregation in our society. It is a genuine problem, and I think it underpins, I think you were referring to this in a way, it does underpin the collapse in social capital, in the things that hold our society together, the glue, the community cohesion. And you have to then look at the way that translates, and I think it translates into a collapse in trust, which we've certainly seen since the 1950s, and the corollary of that, of course, is increased fear. So you've got societies where people don't know their neighbours as they used to, where they don't get on with other generations as they used to, and they're therefore more anxious. If you ask people what worries them, they are worried about strangers. They're worried about immigrants. They're worried about crime. It is very much we live in an age where people are frightened of people that they don't know, in places very often where they're more likely not to know people. And then they look to the state for answers. Some of my colleagues on this panel have already reflected this point. I pay my taxes, and for that I want to be safe. I want to be free from fear. It's a kind of consumerist response. You know, I pay my money, I want my product, I want it back. And politicians have necessarily had to respond. So under the Labour government, we have had 50 acts of Parliament in respect of crime. It has absolutely dominated the legislative programme. Enormous amounts of activity. And this, actually, during a time when we've seen very significant reductions in the amount of crime from all the evidence that we have. We've seen the criminal age of responsibility lowered to 10, which is one of the lowest in the Western world. We lock up a higher proportion of our children in Britain than any other country in Europe, with the exception, I think, of Ukraine. Now, someone was reflecting on whether this is, you know, because people are behaving much worse, or whether we have become less tolerant. I think it is about a lack of tolerance of behaviour that might have been dismissed as mischief in the past. Now we demand something must be done. I've paid my taxes. Where are the police to sort this out? They don't look for a civic response. They look for a statutory one. And that's why we have ASBOs. It's why we have such widespread tagging. It's why we even have, believe it or not, mosquito sprays or their equivalent being used to shoo away children who are gathering around in shopping centres. There are real issues about the use of alcohol, about drugs, and in a few, actually relatively small areas of our country around young gangs and their use of weapons. Just one observation, actually, on the knives and gun stuff, which I think is worth reflecting on. I spent a lot of time, I don't know if any of you did see the stuff that I wrote on the blog, but I mean, basically I don't believe there has been an epidemic of knife crime, and I don't know, Kit was talking about a spike in crime, in this kind of crime in London. I mean, actually, the figures suggest quite the reverse, and I think you've got a rather better story to tell than perhaps you're saying. In fact, knife crime, year on year, this summer to last summer, fell by 14%. So, you know, this is when we had our great epidemic, actually in London, where it was all supposed to be really bad. Knife crime, and the Met have been measuring it, unlike the national stats, actually fell by 14%. Gun crime also fell by 14%. Youth violence generally in the capital year on year is down 7.7%. So, you know, I think actually I'm really unconvinced that we're in the middle of a knife epidemic, and there's plenty more that I could say on the stats, but they are quite impenetrable and rather dull. But I do actually think we have to be clear. Is there really any real evidence that we are at greater risk from our young people? Well, any violent crime is appalling. We must do what we can to reduce it, but the risk of being the victim of any crime in Britain is now at its lowest level, or England and Wales, I should say, lowest level since we started measuring these things in 1981. Violent crime has fallen by 48%. This is on the basis of these kind of self-reporting, huge self-reporting surveys, the British Crime Survey, since 1995. You're at the lowest risk of being the victim of violent crime since the late 1980s. If you're not a teenager or in your early 20s and you don't live in the inner cities, the chances of being a victim of a youth crime are minuscule. The British Crime Survey, I'll just bore you with a couple of stats. If you're aged between 16 and 24 and male, the chances that you will be a victim of a violent crime in a year, 13.4% of those people will be in that group. If you're a girl, actually of the same age, 6.4%. If you're a bloke between 25 and 34, it falls to 5.7%, or a woman, it's 3.3%. These are starting to get pretty small. And if you're over 75, and these are the people who are really scared, it's 0.3% if you're a man and 0.2% if you're a woman. I think this matters. I think this debate matters because so long as the media, and I'm not here to defend the media at all, I mean my journalism on this has been very much at odds with what many of my colleagues have done, but I think it really matters because if young people believe, and increasingly they do, that it's really scary out there, they are more likely, rather than less, to think that I need to carry a gun. We actually make the situation worse by pretending that British society is going to hell in a handcart. I don't think it is. I actually think we've got a lot to applaud our young people for. I think they're a pretty good bunch, and I think it would be a tragedy if we end up being scared of them.
Okay, great introductions from our speakers. I think I just like to just really quickly before we come out to you, just push a bit more on some of those whys. So why is it that we are less tolerant than of youth? Why have we turned hanging out, on the street into a problem? Are we just, we're just making it up? Is there no problem at all with crime? And why are we so worried? And just finally, why does the government seem to have absolutely no clue? So, in whatever order, would like to come back on that.
I think there is an issue in terms of relationships between adults and children. I'll not go into that because we might get onto that as we go. But just, it's kind of interesting what people are arguing here. And there's obviously a level of truth to this idea that there's a public perception which is not really right, and then perhaps there's a relationship to that. But what I find is interesting is, all right, it's a public perception, but the public didn't write the World Report on Violence and Health. They didn't set up the crime unit, the violence unit. They didn't create community safety as a category that local authorities now use as one of their 6 strategic frameworks. This was not Mrs. 73-year-old set this up. Right? This was the political elite, local authorities, government. And you probably find all these same people will say, yeah, the people there, they've got an irrational fear of crime. They're a bit, these old people, they're out of control. They don't really understand, young people, they're decent and all the rest of it. And yet, they are creating these frameworks around community safety. They're filling the streets with community wardens. They're setting up, and so on and so forth. So there seems to be a contradiction here. And I do think it's something to do with the new sort of relationship that politicians have with the public, not just politicians, but institutions. It's for some reason it seems to constantly be tapping into certain level of fear and anxiety. And I think Boris Johnson was an interesting example of this when he became mayor, because before he was mayor, he was talking about the nanny state. Nanny state always intervenes, it does this, does that, and all the rest of it. And I thought, that's interesting, a bit of a libertarian becoming mayor. That'll be interesting to see what happens when he comes in. The first thing he does is, nobody should drink on the tube because of all this. You think, well, where does that suddenly come from? So there's obviously a dynamic which is actually embodied within the people in authority themselves, which actually is encouraging this. It's not just that there's this crazy public, there's something else going on in terms of the elite and, as I say, institutions, local authorities, that they're trying to engage with people through this process, and it seems to have a continuing process and doesn't seem to be letting on.
Thank you. Would like to come in now?
I've had a long go.
Okay. One question, just pick up one question which you raised, which has always struck me as kind of strange, and this is a political issue, which was about the fact that traditionally, of course, crime and law and order has been the subject most focused on by weak governments, not by strong governments. And what was very striking, I think, about post-1997 period was precisely that there was what seemed to be a new and strong government, at least electorally, which focused its first and major plank of legislation, which I think Mark was referring to, was, of course, the Crime and Disorder Act, which centred community safety at the heart. That we had a new government which focused very clearly around issues of safety and security and fear, and has continued since then in that same vein, in a period in which aggregate, at least, crime rates have been going down. And yet this perpetual emphasis upon the idea of society becoming more lawless has been a kind of a recurring theme. And it's a question that I'm not sure that I know the answer to. I think one area in which there may be an answer, and there are obviously a number of issues, one, of course, is that public perceptions are out of sorts with that view. Now, in some senses, of course, if there is a kind of circular argument, the more you actually emphasise how lawless a society is, and the more you look immediately to crime solutions for social problems, the more people actually begin to look through those precise same lenses. But I think there is a real issue about public sector reform that's going on here, and about the way in which this present government and its immediate predecessors has focused considerably about trying to effect change. Now, can governments actually effect change in some kind of real and tangible ways in which people then respond and think that there is a value in governments, there's a value in voting against concerns about voter disinterest and lack of trust in politicians, And there's a real sense that in the first Blair government, that although they put all this legislation in place, they didn't deliver. And so in the second government, there was a focus, a very heavy focus on delivery. A delivery unit was set up, and it was about making change on the ground. And it's about that time we see an emergence, not only of the antisocial behaviour agenda, which is about trying to deliver change on the ground, but you also see the emergence of police community support officers. You see a plethora of developments which are about trying to change things which are tangible and visible, so that people would have some kind of sense that governments do make a difference, can effect change, and can have some kind of resource. I'll stop there.
It's such a complicated question, or such a complex answer to what seems like a simple question. I'm not quite sure where to start. I mean, I think we are generally a more intolerant society. Whether it's the smoking ban, the joy that's greeted with these carriages on trains where you can't use a mobile phone, the fact, the irritation at hearing someone else's iPod or smelling their aftershave, whatever it might be, there's a general growth in intolerance, and that's certainly, I think, the case with young people. You know, when I was a kid, we used to do what's called playing out. I gather that's now antisocial behaviour. And we definitely rang doorbells and ran away. And I'm sure I would get an ASBO against me for being a persistent offender now. So I do think there has been a criminalisation of general intolerance. Sometimes kids are just kids. They're not just criminals. But at the same time, I think there are some alarming manifestations in amongst current youth. I don't necessarily agree with some of the other views that there's a general lack of trust and a general lack of disconnection between youth and older people and all those kind of things. Most kids have grannies, most kids love their grannies, hang around with their grannies and understand old people. But there is a section of society that has an increasing propensity to extreme violence. All of us talking about differences between perception and reality is not much consolation to the 54 families who've lost a teenager in the last 2 years. And the truth is that, you know, the alarming thing is the number of kids now killing kids. Most of the perpetrators of those teen killings have been teenagers themselves. And in the past, you know, child killers were huge headline stories. Not so far, other than in the generality, has that been the case over the last 2 years. And one of the problems we think is that there are specific sections of youth that are becoming increasingly detached from mainstream society, whether they're part of gangs, whether they're just alienated from the educational process. Often they've been through what is frankly a crappy youth justice system that makes things worse, not better. You know, there is a section there where we are reinforcing, and the worst thing about it, is that is truly intergenerational. Those people go on to have kids, and those kids come out even worse at the end. And there's a real sort of moving apart of two sections of society which we're very worried about.
Just a couple of points. The thing I was going to say and forgot, but it kind of relates to something Kit's just said, which is about knives versus guns. London used to have an enormous problem with young people wandering around with guns, and the Met actually introduced an enormously effective operation, Trident, which went in there and dealt to a large extent with gun crime in London. And I think what's happened is that those gangsters have now gone to the kitchen drawer and found themselves a knife instead. Now, knives are much more dangerous than guns, and here's why. If you have a gun in your hand and you want to really frighten somebody from another gang, you can shoot at them. The most likely thing is you're going to miss. The next most likely thing is if you do hit them, you're likely to injure them rather than kill them. The bullet hole's likely to be quite clean. If, however, you've got a knife, and you're going to hurt somebody with that knife, you have to be next to them. You have to be right up close. You have to stab it into their body. And then you probably are going to do it again, because the worst, most dangerous time is between the time you've stabbed them before they've really had a chance to suffer from the wound. So you hit them, you do them 2 or 3 times. Now, if you ask surgeons in East London, where they deal with the wreckage, they will say that 9 out of 10 shooting victims survive. 9 out of 10 knife victims die. Why? Because you put a knife into someone and take it out, you're sawing the inside of their body. And even if you're able to sew them all up actually you're likely to put an infection in there that's going to be impossible for the doctors to deal with, and they'll die of the infection itself. That's the first point. Second quick point, which is just about the media and the fact that we've kind of been there before. In America, in as long ago as 1980, an academic called Doris A. Graber, who my colleagues may well know, wrote this. The mass media supply a large amount of data about specific crimes. That's the third way people get information on crime. There's recorded crime, there's a British crime survey, and you learn down the pub and you read in the paper. These data convey the impressions that criminals threaten the legitimate social system and its institutions. So that's what they fear. And within 20 years of that, a Freedom Forum wrote, disproportionate and superficial coverage fuels public fear and anxiety, which then can cause politicians to overreact and pass unnecessary and costly get tough on crime laws. And finally, the American Bar Association described a lot of the legislation passed in America as misguided, unnecessary, and harmful. I feel we're exactly there now.
I just wanted to come back briefly on the point on guns and gangs. It's not actually accurate. Trident has been very successful, you're quite right, but it's not the case that the gangs have taken up knives. Only about 25% of the deaths in London have been gang related, and we do know that for certainty because we have a 100% record of catching them at the moment. Homicide Squad have a 100% clean-up rate on teen killings. But the alarming thing is the number that are unrelated to gangs. It's one of those odd conundrums that it's more alarming than it's not. And in fact, the numbers that are single blows, that aren't repeated and therefore premeditated killings, they are just single blows struck in anger that kill the other person.
Is that with a knife or a sharp object?
Knife
like
or sharp object, whatever it might be.
Is it not a bottle then, Kit? Isn't that what it is on a Saturday night? That's somebody with a bottle slamming into somebody's
it's quite
face.
hard to kill somebody with a bottle, Mark.
Well, it is, yeah. Hardly anyone dies.
Amazingly, yeah.
Okay, right, so let's get out to the audience now. Can I see a show of hands, please? Yes, can I have this gentleman right here, please? Both, I'll take you in turn.
I'm Al Rajan. I work for The Independent, write a lot about crime, but I also work as a youth worker for a charity called Prospects, which in fact just won Charity of the Year, works on Caledonia Road. And our job as youth workers is basically to go around talking to these large groups of sort of hooded individuals. And just sort of based on that limited experience, just want to make a couple of observations. First is no one's mentioned that really the kids that we're talking about are poor kids. I mean, you know, people aren't scared of middle class and rich kids. I mean, middle class kids that sort of wander around with big sort of chains and skateboards maybe to some extent, but the kids that you're talking about are specifically poor kids. Even if knife crime hasn't gone up, something that has changed between generations is families are more broken now than they were a long time ago. So I'd submit that sort of 9 out of 10 people that I meet on a Monday night don't know at least one of their parents. And so the sort of work that we do is called contact work, partly because I'm not much of an adult, but me and who I wander around with are sort of the exceptions because we are one of very few adults that these kids meet. And so when you're talking about the intergenerational divide, you're literally talking about an absence of contact between kids who might commit crimes and adults of any kind. I mean, if these kids don't go to school, if they've been to young offenders' homes, they just don't come across authoritative adults. And that's, I mean, the final point I want to make is that the biggest challenge you face as a youth worker is not, you know, this fear that you might see when you see a group of 20 kids who are all pissed or got, you know, needles. The biggest problem you have is a total lack of adult-to-adult solidarity in confronting the kids. So when I wander around on a Monday night, it's not that I'm scared someone's going to stab me. I'm scared that another adult's going to turn up and look absolutely shit scared. That's a much bigger obstacle to being effective and useful, and it's a much bigger obstacle to sort of actually getting on with kids, which is why the real solutions, I fear, are not going to come from government, but communities themselves.
Okay, thank you. Can I have the gentleman behind you quickly? Yeah. Keep your hands up, and I will come to you eventually.
I read a really interesting piece of research into gang culture in South London. It covered a few South London boroughs. And effectively, what was found, they interviewed hundreds of young people in these boroughs, which are apparently affected by gang culture. And what they found is, while many organisations were named as gangs by these young people, so you had sort of 25 or 30 groups, 25 or 30 groups coming out as gangs. The research found that only sort of 2 or 3 of them had any kind of structure that we would relate to a traditional kind of gang, you know, and had any kind of identity or genuine purpose or any kind of organisation about it. The rest of them were just groups of young people who happened to name themselves something. So I'm interested in in how we refer to gangs nowadays, and whether our characterizations of young people as in friendship groups has changed, and whether that is just a further symptom of this disengagement that we're talking about.
Thank you. Okay, can I have this lady here in the front, if that's possible? Thanks. And then this lady here on the left after. And then one. Okay, yeah, I'll call. I've seen you now.
I'm 20, and what I've realised is that my generation is the first generation to be raised by parents who themselves rebelled against their parents and therefore have not really been able to pick up good or at least authoritative parenting skills, which has left many people of my generation not really having an adult authority to turn to, and therefore they turn to each other. You know, you turn to your peers for support, to some extent to authority if you look at gang leaders, and for advice. So that's where the disengagement, I believe, comes from between a lot of adults and a lot of kids. But I think another thing that's happened is going back to, sorry, I can't remember your name, your point on there's almost too much choice. We have to construct our own futures almost without advice. We have to research what we want to do with our advice. Is that sort of the
Can you wrap up to give other people a chance? Thanks.
Yeah, the education system has now been sort of set up such that if you're not academically able, then you don't bother going to school, it's boring, therefore you're a troublemaker, and you don't get any qualifications, and of course if you don't get qualifications you don't get a degree, and there's no way of progressing without a degree, which is a sad fact. There's no skills for people to turn to instead nowadays.
Okay, thanks. Okay, can I have the lady here, this gentleman and that gentleman, and then we're going to come back to the panel. I'll come back out. I'll take a note of who else wants to speak. So can you raise? Yes, I think. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay.
I've had an experience just down the road from where I live of a gang who are called the Barrier Boys. And what happened with this particular gang is that a few youths used to hang around near the barrier, which I used to have to walk past to get home. And generally they seemed fine to me. They used to wear hoods. But what they actually spent most of their time doing was playing that game where you throw a penny up against the wall and see who gets the closest to the wall. And they were, apart from that, they went fairly unnoticed. And then suddenly, this happened to be the Liberal Democrats started a campaign in the area saying, you know, the Barrier Boys, everyone's frightened of the Barrier Boys. They're this, you know, gang that hang out on the corner. And they did a campaign to get the Barrier Boys removed. They succeeded because then the police and community police officers or whatever went every day and removed the Barrier Boys from the barrier. So their gang was, you know, broken up. And then, interestingly, whereas I'd never had a conversation with anyone ever before about these Barrier Boys, suddenly I started having conversations with parents, you know, when I was coming home from school or whatever, who were talking about the problem of the Barrier Boys. So out of nothing, apparently, a few kids playing a game against a wall, suddenly we had this, you know, big campaign, and then parents being scared of them. And I think that, to me, illustrates some of what goes on here. I think I've just got a quick question, which is, what do you, the panel, think about some of the one issue, the CRB checks that have been brought in? Because I think when we talk about intergenerational fear or whatever, then the response to that seems to be, let's get everyone checked out because we're scared of everyone. And to me, that seems to just reinforce the problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Interesting question. Yes, I have 3 people here that have had their hand up, yes, him, for a long time. And then I'm going to come back to the panel and come back out. So,
yeah, I just wanted to challenge Mark Easton on his point about picking up knives, young people picking up knives because they're frightened of crime. I don't think that happens at all. I think young people pick up knives because they've been victims of crime. He seemed to suggest that young people are just somehow scared and then they go and run to the closet and get a knife or to the kitchen. The other thing I'd like to say is about poverty, linked within what this bloke said. It is poor children committing and being victims of knife crime, and they're not reporting it to the police. So I think where you say that, sorry, where you say that, sorry, I've lost the point, but you know what I'm saying, huh?
Yeah. Okay, can I have no, the one there first, because it's been waiting longer. Yeah, then there and there. Yeah, and then 1 and 2, and then we'll come back to the panel.
I'll try and keep it short. First, I was thinking, in regards to kind of the growth of intolerance, does anyone think that maybe this growth of this right not to be offended has something to do with that? So kind of, because no one can offend me, I have my right not to be offended, then I should be intolerant of people who do. And also, to the lady who was 20 at the start, I find it hard to believe that there are no longer any plumbers, so you can't get anywhere without a degree. And I also find it hard to agree that nobody has ever rebelled against their parents until the 60s.
Yes, with the cap, and then back to you. Thank you.
I'll try and be as very quick. I have every sympathy with Mark Easton's point about the way in which the traditional chasm between youth and age leads to hysteria around the subject of youth crime. I do, however, believe with youth and crime, we shouldn't be scared, we should be terrified. Not because of the crimes that youth might commit, but because of the crimes we have committed against them. We live in a world when children, when surveyed at GCSE entrance age, say that as a career, 50% of them would choose famous. 75% of girls would be glamour models if they could, or footballers' wives as a career. We are selling our children's dreams which can't possibly make them happy and which degrade, possibly destroy the future social fabric that them and their progeny will inherit. Just to actually align this point to Christopher Monckton. Christopher Monckton in Chelsea, the banker, was killed by a young gentleman who had an obsession with being famous and wished to accumulate as much money as he possibly could to fund a rap music career. That basically is my point. I think, to sum up, I think our consumer society is in essence eating our children. That's the root cause of where we are.
Thank you. And can I have this gentleman here that's been waiting a long time? Yeah, him.
Hello. I'm now 35, and I realised that when I was 16, when I just finished my GCSEs, the first thing that me and my friends did was to get straight down the pub. Canterbury was a great place because it had lots and lots of pubs, and all the landlords turned a blind eye to 16-year-olds trying to get into booze it up with everybody who was over 18, just as much as the newsagents were happy to sell us cigarettes and off-licenses sell us booze for when we were not in the pub. The point being that a question I'd like to ask the panel is, where exactly do they think 16 to 18-year-olds should be nowadays, now that every landlord, against their best intentions, clamps down and is so paranoid about their license that getting into a pub when you're 18 might be lucky. Even when you're 21, it can be a bit of a rough ride. It does seem to me that a lot of talk about state intervention misses the point that actually the state has spent a lot of time trying to meddle in what were informal relationships amongst people socially. That they talk about the breakdown of society, they talk about intergenerational relationships, is all very well-meaning, but it seems to suggest that what we really do need is to get back to making up a sense of society and interpersonal relation for ourselves, rather than wait for community safety officers to do it for us.
Thank you. Okay, now can I have the panel come back on those points? Please, can we keep remarks short, about a minute and a half each, if that's possible. Yeah. Stuart, do you want to go first?
I do. I'll try and throw out a little bit of controversy, as everyone seems to be so nice about young people and all the rest of it. I mean, it's worth asking this question. The question of intolerance. People are saying we're intolerant of young people today, but at a certain level, I think you could turn that around and say, well, it's not true actually, because previously you'd have a certain sense of adulthood and adult values and what children did. There'd be a relaxed, but there'd also be an enforcement of what is right and wrong by adults. And I think that is a significant question in terms of how a lot of these issues have emerged, especially the antisocial behaviour ones, in terms of should adults have should they be more authoritative in terms of their action? I think they should. I think the idea of adult authority is a significant thing, and I don't think it's an issue for me to say we should celebrate youth. I think it's more that we should be recognising that there needs to be a greater sense of adult authority and adult norms that are actually thrown out. And I'm going to risk myself creating a moral panic here or arguing a moral panic position, but I'm interested, and I've done, this is purely from media speculation. Give us a minute. Media speculation. But I'm interested in these murders where if you hear, and I'm going to caricature it, Bob was walking along the street and someone says, "Oh, you're a big fanny," and he says, "All right, you've just dissed me," and he kills him. Peter is on a bus and someone says, "Do you mind not smoking?" and he jumps up and stabs him to death. Well, and it seems to be there's a curious thing here. Now, as I say, I am running the risk of creating a moral panic, but is this a new type of murder? It doesn't mean there's more murders necessarily, but it's funny that it's often understood as this is part of macho culture. And I would say you could turn that round and actually say what being macho used to mean was being a man, right? Which meant an element of self-control. You might be tough, it might lead to fighting, and you might end up with a few people murdering. But I don't think this is, if this is something which seems to be, this doesn't seem to be an issue of macho culture. It seems to be this thing, as you were saying at that point about I'm very easily offended, that it's my fragile sense of myself. And that seems to be a problem, not just of youth at the bottom of society, but I think more generally that there's a certain disconnection between young people in society.
Finish. Quick.
There's a disconnection between young people in society that actually connects them to something so that they become adult, right? So they become mature, so they have character. So it's more of a squeal. It's kind of childlike, actually, that sort of murder, rather than being macho.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Adam, would you like to come back on some of those points?
Yeah, I'll just make two points, and the first as an illustration of I think a number of points that were made by a number of people there, which is, and it goes to the question, well, where should 16 to 18-year-olds be? And we did a interesting bit of empirical research looking at the implementation of dispersal orders. Of course, they're a particular new power which allows the police to disperse groups of two or more from certain designated location, and in some senses begs a real question about, well, where should they go? If you're dispersing young people from doing what young people do, which is congregating in public spaces, then where should they be going? But actually there was a positive side to some of the experiences, which was, and it's why we called the research sticking plasters and wake-up calls, it was the wake-up call. In some communities, it actually served as a way of actually starting a conversation, which is things that got so bad in terms of relations that adults did begin to actually talk to and engage with young people as to what was going on. Now, that's not an advert for taking out dispersal orders, please, because these things could have happened without the dispersal order, but it's about the lack of that kind of engagement across different agencies and between different people. Just the second point I was going to make, and it goes to the issue of, I think, about the consumerism and the implications, particularly for young people. And it's a bit of a flippant point, but I'll make it nevertheless. And it's that, and if you look at the growth of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder amongst young people, it strikes to me as an analogy, as a metaphor rather, of contemporary society, that ADHD tells us something, and its growth, about not just contemporary young people and the pressures on them, of making choices in this kind of a culture in which kind of certain success symbols are held out, and the short-termism in which people have to generate those things. But it also, I think, tells us something about contemporary government, because I think attention deficit hyperactivity disorder it reflects a lot of contemporary ways of responding to young people.
Okay.
Yeah, just 3 quick points. Stress again, there have been an awful lot of general remarks about youth generally, and I think we need to be careful about not letting the specific infect the general view. Generally, young people are the same as they were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. There are some specific groups about whom I do think we need to be alarmed, and about whom I do think we need to be smarter and do clever things, and the gentleman just here is exactly right. If you look at people who end up at the end of the conveyor belt in young offenders institutions, they all have the same characteristics. They all fall out of school at 14. They all have some kind of dysfunctionality at home. They have low educational attainment. They often come from the same parts of the city. There are lots of issues that can be looked at in specifics. I think given that we're talking about a very small number of people here, we're talking about hundreds, not thousands, then in the words of Malcolm Gladwell, we can focus on it and sort it out as an issue. Secondly, I would say about gangs. There is a growing issue in London about gangs, but you have to be careful about the definition of what is a gang. There are some very, very serious and very nasty gangs, and the Serious Crime Director of the Met does a very, very good job of clearing them up. But the ones that cause the problems are the violent territorial youth gangs who own a postcode for no apparent reason other than it's there, and that they have no sense that there's anything else for them in society. They look across the river at the glittering towers in Canary Wharf and think that's not about them. There's nothing to do with them, and all they have when they open the front door is the pavement. And so they'll seek crazily to try and defend it and protect it. The third issue is about this idea of the right not to be offended. I do think there is a growing, and I'm as much a part of it as anybody else, crankiness in society that we are intolerant of the behaviour of others, and in particular youths. And one final thing I would just say, and that's about the relative safety of London. You will know that we're looking for a new Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at the moment, and there have been a lot of people pushing the case to have an American, particularly an American who did such a brilliant job in New York. New York is fantastic. And even Simon Heffer has written in the Telegraph this week about how safe he felt in New York compared to London. Well, last year New York had just short of 500 murders and we had 160. So in relative terms, we are 3 times safer than New York in terms of homicide, and I don't think we should forget that.
Okay, thank you. Mark.
Yes, I want to just pick up on that point about CRB checks, actually, and the relationship between adults and children. If you look at the kids that Kit's just been talking about, who do end up, and they are unusual, who end up in gangs, these are people who inhabit very often a world without any adult interaction whatsoever. They don't talk to their parents, they don't go to school, they haven't been to school for years. It's a completely parallel world with a parallel morality. If you ask people, generally, what do you think is the best way of solving the problems of youth crime and bad behaviour by young people? They'll say, well, the thing is they're bored. We want more youth stuff for them to do. And I think that gets us halfway there, because I don't actually think it is about more youth clubs. I think it's about more youth workers. I don't think it's about having more football pitches. I think it's about having more football coaches. Actually, for a lot of young people, it's about sitting down and having an evening meal with your mum and dad and your brother as much as it is about anything else. So adult interaction is absolutely critical to developing the next generation, for some of you, your generation. And without it, we are lost. And that's why I think the CRB thing is such a blinking disaster, because it just makes makes young people think that adults are all potential paedophiles, and makes adults think that if they're going to engage with young people, they'll be accused of being a paedophile. So anyway, I absolutely agree with you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so can I have the lady there at the back, and then this gentleman here, and this lady for now, and then I'll come back to you. Just
I thought Adam was going to make a different point about ADHD, because I think it is a really interesting thing, but I think I wouldn't necessarily put it at the point of government, because I think it is about adult authority. Instead of now parents being able to tell their kids behave, it is much easier to look at a medical solution, so it takes adults off the hook in saying it's a lack of our authority, and perhaps interesting in a way that then young people get medicalised, problematised, and it put in a more sort of social sphere, rather than I do and tell do what I'm told to behave, and I expect my mom or dad or adult figures to do that. And I think maybe that's the problem, really, is by doing that we're selling our kids short. And I think that's the worry. I think probably on the whole kids are fine, adults are fine, but I think this disconnect means that are we selling our kids short, and really are they not achieving the potential they should achieve with a lack of adults taking the responsibility and authority they should do?
Okay, thank you. Can I have this lady here in the middle, please? She's been waiting a long time, and then that gentleman there in the middle at the back. But first, this lady, please. Thank you.
As I'm sure some of you read, it ran in The Guardian. I don't know if it ran anywhere else. About a month ago, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child came out with a report basically condemning the UK for the way that young people are demonized here. So we tend to talk in societal terms and generational terms, but I'm wondering if any of you on the panel have thoughts about what might be particular to here now that makes that the case. Just one observation before I pass the mic on. I think that the point about class and poverty is really important. I remember, I'll be aging myself by saying how long ago this was, but many years ago I read an article about the Bloods and the Crips in Los Angeles and some of the research that was done around youth gangs in Los Angeles. And it talked about the creation of a subculture by people who weren't part of the larger culture. And that's certainly something that I see here. And of course it gets reinforced, because if you're misbehaving in Richmond, the cops will probably treat you differently than if you're misbehaving in Southwark. So as I say, I do think that that class issue gets reinforced in law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. That's all.
Thank you. Can I have that gentleman there behind you, please? That. There.
Thank you. My name is Austin Ivory. I work for London Citizens, which is the capital's largest alliance of civic organisations, 110 churches, mosques, schools across the capital. And in North Kensington, we're organising, we're the people, by the way, who brought the capital the London Living Wage, which Boris has endorsed, and he also endorsed back in April at our assembly, CitySafe, which is one of our campaigns and programmes. And in North Kensington, I'm working with a number of different institutions, a school, the very school, in fact, where Kojo Tenja was killed. He attended that school. I'm working with that school, a mosque, and various churches in North Kensington. We're holding a meeting this week. What would the panel suggest? Because I agree, by the way, with so much I've heard tonight, that the problem is the intergenerational division, the fact that the solutions so far have come from the state and have concentrated more on youth clubs and separating youth, which seems to be the very mistake, given that it's the disassociation in the first place which has caused the problem. I'm holding a meeting this week of the primary leaders of those institutions. What 2 or 3 things do you think a whole series of institutions, community institutions in North Kensington, that's to say youth clubs, churches, mosques, schools and so on, working together could do, given that there are postcode gangs in the area, there have been murders, and it is an area of relatively unusually high violence? What 2 or 3 things could I be suggesting to them that they could achieve by working together?
Thank you. Can I have the gentleman there at the back, please?
I have said that constantly, not please don't generalize.
Yeah, Kevin.
Like
waiting
5
from the
times,
beginning.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, you're down.
Hello. It's interesting to see the reaction to young people in the face of youth crime and other problems associated with youth today. And more interestingly is how the youth are problematized and labeled, whether it be as antisocial or medicalized as suffering from problems such as ADHD. The individuals, therefore, to me, being regarded as somewhat maladjusted and needing to be reintegrated into the mainstream of society, whether it be through counseling and a whole host of measures. But I believe that perhaps we're overlooking something here. Perhaps the possibility that these problems might be symptoms or manifestations of wider and systemic social problems, and perhaps there needs to be a refocus on social systems and how perhaps they can work better for the youth as opposed to the youth being a problem. Perhaps this is a manifestation of the systemic problems that currently exist in our society. And the gentleman on my far left there did very well in talking about the consumer society, and someone else mentioned poverty. And these are a whole host of issues that we need to look at. It's not the individual who's the problem. It's the social system, society generally, that is the problem. That needs to change and readjust to the individual as opposed to the other way around.
Can I have the lady with the white jumper there, please? And then the gentleman next to her. Oh, okay, all right.
Yes, hello. I was wondering, moving aside from youth crime, I was wondering if the general problems our society seem to have with the public space, being a space that's growingly seen as an area of the unknown and hence potential problems and potential dangers, doesn't have a ripple effect on the youth, since the youth, and even more those that don't have the financial means, have as only space available the public space.
Thank you. Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to take 3 more points. And that's, now this gentleman here, then that young lad at the back, and then that lady there. Yeah, you. Yeah.
Okay.
Who's been
Well,
waiting ages.
Well, I think it's really interesting the way that adults relate to children. And one of the things that I found really interesting is I recently started working in a school. And much to my surprise, schools have changed quite a lot since I was there. And now when you have children misbehaving in schools, and I mean swearing at teachers, arriving drunk, teachers have lost the confidence to actually deal with those children, and they're reliant on the community support officers or police officers. And as someone who, has a long history of being on the left, I think the issue of relying on the state to deal with these things is really problematic. And the lack of confidence that teachers have for fear of being sued, or those types of things, I think is a real problem around these issues.
Thank you. And then can I have the just at the back, next to the glass, please.
And I just wanted to say I think one of the key problems in this issue is success and how we define success in this society. And I think for a lot of young people, the media is hammering home this image and this idea that success is when you have a big house, a big car, and you're famous. And the way to do this is by winning X Factor, and not through kind of conventional means of hard work and education. And if we want our children to go to school and be scared of a criminal record, we need them to aspire towards goals such as big jobs as lawyers or in, I'm not sure other professions, but more respectable professions.
Okay.
That's my...
Thank you. Can I have this lady? And then last point there at the back, and then we're coming back to the panel. Okay. Please.
If people want to continue discussing consuming children, come to the next session. But the point I wanted to make, I'm quite interested in a couple of different strands that I think reinforce each other. And I suppose I kind of call it the grumpy old men situation, or the grumpy old people. Because it's almost like the thing about being grumpy is that if you lose authority, you become cantankerous. And I think the two things that are going on is this kind of complete trivialization. So really harmless behavior by young people becomes interpreted as threatening. I thought that was a great story told over there. On the one hand, and on the other hand, people just don't know what it does mean to be an adult or what it does mean to be authoritative. So the idea of what it means to be a man, which is the point that Stuart raised, I think is a real problem. Well, what does it mean to be a man in this society? How do you assert yourself? Do you assert yourself by reacting violently, or do you assert yourself by reacting in a self-contained way? I mean, that is completely unclear. So I think the problems we have is, on the one hand, this sort of sense of, well, at root, this sense of what does it mean to be an adult is a real problem. What it means to have authority is a real problem. And then that means that people become very intolerant of all kinds of behaviour, which in the past was regarded with a great deal of tolerance. Like, for example, young people drinking, which never used to be perceived as a big problem.
Okay, thank you. And then last point there at the back, and then we're coming back to the panel. Thanks.
Hi. Just to be quick, I just wanted to say I agreed with this concept that this increasing criminalization of the youth is having a detriment, and the CRB checks, people not being able to talk to the youth, is a major problem, and that this rise in violence being used as an excuse to further criminalize the youth and have more police and more clampdowns on them is further increasing this separation. And just to bring it back to a concrete example recently in London of how this one-sided criminalization is taking effect, you had the carnival, the Caribbean Carnival in Notting Hill, where antisocial, under the guise of stopping antisocial behavior, like hundreds of youths were arrested for having dogs, for showing aggressive behavior, for having this and that. Meanwhile, this is the celebration of Afro-Caribbean culture in London, the largest of its kind. It attracts people from all over Europe. It's become one of the faces of London. Meanwhile, the youths growing up in these communities in Ladbroke Grove are criminalized and cut off from the expression of their culture, their music, a genuine expression of their creative aspirations for the future. And, this is a very concrete example of what's not being done and how it's being used as an excuse to further criminalize them and increase the police presence in the community.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so now in reverse order, the panel to conclude in 1 minute each. So Mark, can you go first? Thanks.
Okay, 2 or 3 things to help you sort out kids in, was it southwest London, West London? North Kensington, okay. They need boundaries, they need horizons, they need to have their ambitions increased, and they need a lot more connections with people of other generations. We need a new narrative for our young people that isn't about the X Factor. Gentleman at the back, are you listening? It was your question, anyway, X Factor and youth crime. And that's why I'm just going to read you a couple of things about teenagers that we haven't discussed, because the reason we've talked about crime, where's the gentleman who criticised us for talking about that? This was the title, Scared of the Kids, the rising panic about youth crime. That seems reasonable, we might have talked about crime. Anyway, not talking about crime. Teenagers are more likely to do voluntary work than people from any other generation. In fact, they're 10 times more likely to be volunteering than regularly in our communities than being antisocial in them. More teenagers than ever before are staying on at school after 16. More than ever are going on to further and higher education. Despite the vilification, young people are more likely to say England is a good place to grow up in, 90%, than adults, 71%. And yet it is they who are most likely to be victims of crime. So I say 3 cheers for our teenagers.
We claps for everybody at the end, okay? Just because we're running out of time.
I have my own one.
1 minute.
Just quickly, the increase in criminalisation, I think, is generally accepted to have not worked. You know, we're locking up nearly 10,000 young people. 78% of young people who go through a young offenders institution will reoffend within 12 months, costing us 90 grand to lock them up again. It makes no sense. In many ways, it's made it worse, I think, rather than better over the last few years, and we think, be smarter about that. On the class culture success issue, I totally agree with what you're saying, although I think there are lots of individuals from lower socioeconomic groups who navigate the culture wars pretty successfully, but there are a lot who don't. If you go down to the estates in Peckham and Streatham and those parts of London, they will tell you that the number one bad influence in young men's lives is rap, ragga, aggressive culture that they might see in and around them that teaches them short-term materialism. And the only way they can get it, and this comes on to solutions, is through violence and through crime, because they lack an education. You're quite right that the solution is not more youth clubs. I don't actually think it's more youth workers necessarily. It's actually teaching them to read, write and add up. There's an awful lot of work spent on interventions across London, buying expensive sound equipment to teach kids to be DJs and rappers when they haven't actually got the basics required to be economically active in society, and I think we can do a bit more about that. The lady who talked about public space is quite right. Pretty much every public space in central London now says no ball games. Where am I supposed to play when I'm an 8-year-old kid? If I do kick a ball around, I'm immediately characterised as antisocial. We need to do something about that. And then just specifically, last thing on the Notting Hill Carnival, chap who pointed out that incident was slightly disingenuous. This was 150 young men who gathered together specifically to travel to the carnival in a group of 150 with, let's put it this way, not pleasant intentions. They were apprehended, a lot of dangerous dogs were lifted from them, and a lot of trials are ongoing from that. So it wasn't quite the situation that you outlined. Any group of 150 gathering together to go to any kind of event like that ought to cause alarm.
Thank you. Adam, please.
Okay, just a few points. I mean, I think the point that's been made about social class and about kind of wider structural issues are kind of key to this. And I mean, that was the point that I was trying to make with regard to actually social mobility is narrowing rather than the inverse. And I think the pressures that causes are significant. And without wanting to kind of leave aside the very important work that needs to be focused on where real harm is taking place, and often it's young people who are actually the victims of real harm. My real concern with what's happened over previous years and what is continuing to happen is that we continue to see social problems through a crime and disorder lens. And that means we see things and we see people in different ways. We've actually heard talk of the failings of the education system. We've heard talk of drugs. We've heard talk of alcohol. These are not per se necessarily crime problems, and probably the starting point shouldn't necessarily be crime in terms of actually trying to address them. So we do need to, and I think one of the perverse effects of us looking at things increasingly and always often through a crime lens is we fall back on what are often simple and appear easy solutions, and too often they're policing-based solutions. That's not to deny that they have an important place. But I think that the concerns are, and somebody made this point, that increasingly what actually that means is we formalise what are often better informal responses to forms of disorder.
Okay, thank you. Stuart.
God. Well, I think we have an immature society at the minute. I think that's why we criminalise, because there's an inability to distinguish adulthood from childhood. But that means an assertion of adulthood as authority. And I think there's a problem in terms of this idea of punishment, because I'm actually quite into punishment. Because especially there's this discussion about adults in particular in terms of prison even, that you shouldn't put adults in prison. And the reason that nobody really can defend prison today, and the reason you can't is because you assume that people are vulnerable. You know, a prisoner will go into prison and he'll just be damaged by the experience. And society finds it very difficult to punish people or use their authority because they've got such a vulnerable sense of people in general. And that's why the demonization debate I find problematic. I think a lot of people that say young people are being demonized, it's because they're looking at them as victims. And that is a much more important category, I think, to understand this debate, that young people are understood as victims much less than this idea that they're being demonized by some authority. It's that they are understood as victims. And the reason of the collapse of the sort of adult-child relationship is that we're all seen as victims. Young people and adults. Adults are victims of young people on the street. Children are victims of adults who are potential paedophiles, so on and so forth. And that is a much more important way to understand what's actually happening in society in relation to this debate.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank our great panel.